Hello, and welcome back to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. It's 2026, this is season 2, and I'm so grateful and excited to have you here. Now, today, what we're going to be talking about is natural disaster nutrition for your horses. If you're listening in Australia right now, there's a good chance you've been impacted by some sort of natural disaster or have friends and family who have been impacted just in the last 30 days. Our beautiful country is certainly living up to Dorothea McKellar's description of droughts and flooding rains, and we'll throw a few bushfires in there as well. So what I want to cover today, and big thanks to Zach for messaging me and requesting this episode, is how to feed your horses during and following emergencies when their normal feeding situation has been upended, leaving you in a spot of bother trying to figure out what is best to feed. Anyone who's previously been through these natural disasters with horses knows that in an emergency, feeding is sometimes a take-what-you-can-get situation. But with just a few tweaks to what you do, how you feed can be the difference between your horse coming through with flying colours or descending into acute or long-term issues like ulceration, hindgut dysbiosis, colic, and various other serious and not so serious complications. How you feed will in large part determine whether your horse copes with the stress of the event and the time that follows, or tips them over the edge into some sort of health issue. In this episode, I will do my best to keep it simple and practical and talk you through how to feed through fires and floods or any other emergency situation you may be facing. There really is one core rule, and that is to keep the diet as close to normal as you possibly can. But that is not always possible. So let's have a look at the strategies that will help you do the best you can when life gets momentarily tipped on its head for you and your horses. The first place to start, as it always is in nutrition, is with water. But before we go there, let's just look at why balanced nutrition is so important in the lead up to these unpredictable situations. Now, on the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast, we talk all sorts of things horse nutrition related. And if you haven't heard the very first episode, Feeding Your Horse Like a Horse, I'd really encourage you to go back and have a listen to that one, because I talk about the 5 key things we need to do when feeding our horses to keep them as healthy and happy as possible. The reason why that fits into the context of natural disaster nutrition is because the healthier you can have your horse going into any situation, be that dealing with a natural disaster or, going to perform at an event or traveling long distance because you're moving interstate, doesn't really matter what you're doing with your horse. One thing is always true, and that is the healthier your horse is going into that situation, the healthier they will be coming out of that situation. And when we think specifically in the context of feeding horses during natural disasters, or really any, it doesn't have to be a natural disaster, it can be any situation where for whatever reason your horse's normal pasture or hay or feed is momentarily not readily available, and you have to change up the way that you feed them quite quickly. But the healthier they are going into that situation, the better they'll cope. And there's a couple of main reasons for that. So one is we know that when a horse has got a very healthy hindgut microbiome, so when the bacteria and the fungi and other microbes that live in their hindgut are healthy and balanced and very diverse, it's much harder to knock them out of balance into a state of dysbiosis. So if your horse has got a very healthy hindgut going into a natural disaster situation, you'll have a much better chance of being able to completely upend their diet, not because you choose to, but because you have to. And their gut will cope a lot better with that than if you have a horse that's already got hindgut microbiome or, gut health that's already a little bit out of balance or very out of balance. When you go into a situation where you suddenly have to change your horse's diet and their gut was already struggling, they are at much higher risk of colic, and predominantly colic is what we know. There's research showing that, for example, horses that have got less diverse microbes in their hindgut are at a higher risk of colic. So if you're already feeding your horse in a way that supports hindgut microbe diversity and general gut health, then you've got a lot more freeboard, I guess. You're not going to sink your horse so quickly with changing their diet. And that episode 1 and lots of other episodes. So I think it's episode 9 with Dr. Belinda where we talk about the hindgut microbiome. And then there's episodes following on from that one where we talk about how to feed for hindgut health. It's so important to always be feeding for hindgut health so that if something suddenly changes for your horse, they will cope with it a lot better than if you're not already consciously feeding them for good hindgut health. And then the other reason balanced nutrition is always important and becomes particularly important when your horse is in one of these natural disaster situations is that if you know that you're meeting their vitamin and mineral requirements, if your horse ends up, say, in a flood situation where they're up to their knees or worse in mud and they're in manky water because you can't get them to high ground or they have to travel through flood water to get to high ground, and then they're in say in the North Queensland situation at the moment, it's hot, it's humid, and skin conditions are absolutely rife. So if your horse has got a functioning immune system in those situations, you've got a much better chance that they will be able to fight off those bacterial and fungal infections, or even if they just cut themselves in one of these situations. If their immune system is functioning and their body is healthy, they'll heal so much faster. And heaven forbid if your horse ever gets burnt in a bushfire, which is horrific. I know I've helped a lot of people over the years through that situation. The healthier the horse is, the faster they will heal when they're burnt badly, because it takes an awful lot of nutrition to actually heal the body and recover from that. So always being conscious of how well you're feeding your horse is incredibly important. This is something that I'm very passionate about, and I've spent the last 20 years basically building software to help you actually get your horse's diet balanced, because it's so hard to know whether are you meeting iodine requirement? Are you meeting selenium requirement? Is your horse getting enough zinc? It's really hard to know that unless you do some sort of calculations. And we've built the My Happy Horse app now to help you do that. So either, ask if your feed supplier to help you look at the diet to make sure it's balanced, or, do your own calculations, reach out to a horse nutritionist to help you, or jump online and grab the My Happy Horse nutrition app to help you make sure that their diet's balanced. Because honestly, it just gives your horse a much better chance of coming through any of these situations in really good health. So back to water. Water is a really interesting one, and it's a massive part of nutrition, but we often don't think about it as a part of nutrition. But basically the rule for me with water, and this comes from my dairy nutrition undergrad professor at university, who said to us in a lecture, and we were talking about dairy cows at the time, but he said, if their water is not clean enough for you to drink, then it's not clean enough. And I've extended that out for us as horse people to say, if your horse's water is not clean enough for you to drink, then it's not clean enough. So making sure that your horse always has access to a clean source of water is really important. And you bring natural disasters into this situation and it becomes even trickier. So for example, if you're in a bushfire situation, you've lost electricity, or in a flood situation, you've lost electricity, and you rely, as I do, on electricity to get our bore water out of the ground or our tank water out of the tanks. If you have no power, it becomes quite difficult to get water. So if you're at risk of, and I guess we all are in some way, shape or form, but some of us are much more at risk at various points in time of some of these natural disasters than others. If you're at risk, and particularly if you're being told that you need to be prepared, make sure that you think about water for your horse and having enough water somehow stored that's clean water and accessible. So if you do rely on bore water, making sure that you've got as much bore water out of the ground while you've still got electricity as you possibly can. Do be aware that dams and also floodwater are not necessarily good sources of water, particularly if it is flooding or if you've had massive bushfire go over and there's lots of fire, ash and debris in your water sources. Do give your horse another option for water if they're still at home. Give them another option. I was watching Alay, Tamaya's big thoroughbred, here the other day, and we were in our dam. The kids were swimming and the dogs were swimming in our dam, and it had just filled up. We'd had a massive storm the day before, and the dam had actually filled up with water. It was about half full, and it filled up. And the water looks okay. I mean, we were swimming in it, it smelt fine. But she came down to the dam because we were there, and she put her head down. She had a few sips of water. And I said to Tamaya, just go and open the gate, because I had the gate closed where her trough is, so that she didn't bother Breeze, or actually it's more like Breeze, our 30-something-year-old horse, bothers her. At feeding time, I had the gate closed, so Tamaya went and opened the gate, and she went up and she had a massive drink out of the trough, which we fill with our clean bore water for them. So they have access to dam water, but consistently the horses at the dam will choose to go and drink the clean water out of the trough. And water is so important, particularly if it's hot and dry. But in any of these situations, water is so important because the likelihood is, we'll talk about hay a lot in a minute, but the likelihood is you're going to have them on hay in these situations where, you lose access to their pasture for one reason or another. If they are out on pasture, you need them to drink lots of water so that they'll also eat lots of feed, and also so that everything in their gut keeps moving. The last thing we want is horses in these situations to get dehydrated, and then they're at higher risk of things like impaction, colic, and just complications that come with dehydration as well. So there's two bits to it: making sure that you can get water, making sure that you can actually access water, and then the second bit is making sure that the water is clean enough for them to drink. Now, if you've had to evacuate somewhere and all of a sudden your horses have ended up on unfamiliar water sources, so if you've gone from having either bore water or dam water into chlorinated town water, and that's really unfamiliar for your horses, you may find that they're not wanting to drink. And sometimes horses, just when they're away from home, don't really want to drink. I've never been able to figure out why that is. It's like a stress thing, I guess. They'll drink really well at home, but then as soon as you take them out, even if you know that they're used to drinking out of buckets, and even when you take your own water with you, we have a couple of horses that they just won't drink when they're out. So what I've started doing in recent times is taking with me some syringes that have got, and it depends on the horse what I mix it with, but they've got salt and either molasses or apple sauce, or you could, boil up carrots or something really bland, mash them up and mix it up with that and a bit of water, but salt and some sort of base in a syringe. So, you may have previously used like a gut supplement syringe or another electrolyte syringe, some big tube that you can use, and just paste them with that, because the salt will make them thirsty and then they'll go and drink. So I've been using for our big thoroughbred she's like 585 kilos. She's reasonably tall. She's nearly 17 hands and reasonably solid. So she's a biggish horse. And I will give her 15 grams of salt mixed in. She gets it mixed in molasses, and that helps her to drink. It makes her thirsty and it will get her to drink. So for a horse, upwards of 600 kilos, about 15 grams of salt. For a pony, you might only need 5 grams of salt, and for a smaller horse, 400 up to 600 kilos, you might only need 10 grams of salt. But the sodium in the salt actually switches on their thirst response and will make them drink. So first tip is if you're away from home, or even if you're at home and your horse is stressed and is not drinking as well as it should, and you know that the water is clean and that there's no other issues stopping them from drinking, then giving them a little bit of salt can just encourage them to drink. And if for whatever reason they're a bit sodium deficient, it will also help them eat. It's a good thing to do. Just don't overdo it, no more than once a day, pasting them with it, and making sure that if you do give them salt, that they've got free access to water for at least 3 hours after that, because they'll keep drinking for quite a period of time to rehydrate themselves and balance the sodium in their blood back out again. So I guess overall comment is be really conscious of water. Make sure it's clean, make sure it's readily available, and if they're not drinking, then resort to using a little bit of salt. While we're on salt, do just make sure that your horse has got access to salt. So if they're at home, and if you've been able to stay at home, but say there's lots of things that can happen in these situations. But the two big ones that I've got in my mind while I'm doing this podcast are that a fire has come through and burnt out all of your pasture, and either caused you to have to evacuate somewhere, or you've been able to stay at home, you just don't have any pasture anymore. Or massive flooding, where flooding comes through and pretty much covers all of your pasture. And then, when the floodwaters go down, you've obviously got a period of time where there's still no grass and it's very muddy. So they're the two situations I've got in mind, and just making sure that your horse has got salt, free choice salt. If you can get hold of it. Sometimes you're not probably going to be able to if you flooded in and didn't have any on hand. But if whatever way you do it, try to make sure that you can get salt out to your horses so that they have salt, because it's really important for them to have salt all the time. The next big consideration, and probably the first place our minds go, I know it's for me, this is the first place my mind goes when you're in a natural disaster situation, is what do I fill my horse up with? So if they were out grazing and you've lost your pasture, or if you had hay and either you've lost hay in a fire or a flood, or you've had to evacuate and you haven't been able to take much, if any, hay with you, your first question is, well, what do I fill them up with? And the best answer to that, and the best situation, will be if you can find hay that is either as close to the hay that your horse was on in the first place, or as close to the pasture that your horse was on. So say, for example, your horse was on a grass-based pasture, which most of our horse pastures are grass-based pastures. If you can then find a grassy hay to put them on, it's almost a like-for-like swap. It's just that one is pasture and the other one is hay. So that's your best case scenario. And if you can do that, then you're really almost home and hosed in these situations, particularly if your horse had a really healthy gut leading into it. That change, it's never ideal to change a horse's diet really rapidly, but when you're forced to change your horse's diet really rapidly, if you can do it with as like for like as possible, so pasture for hay, mixed grassy pasture for mixed grassy hay, that's your best possible scenario. The problems start to arise, and the stress, I guess, for you start to arise when you can't find something that's like for like. And it's going to happen, almost undoubtedly, and it depends where in the country you are and what sort of hay supplies are normally like for you. But if you, say, go to find a mixed grassy hay and all you can find is oaten hay, then the oaten hay is going to be better. And now my brain's just fragmented into about 15 pieces, because it's like, but what about this situation? What about that situation? But for a normal horse that doesn't have any health issues, so, for a horse that doesn't have laminitis or any other metabolic kind of condition, if you can only get oaten hay, then that's going to provide them the bulk that they need to keep them full. It's certainly not ideal if you can only find one type of hay, but sometimes your hand is forced in having to provide whatever it is you can find. Now, that to me is almost a worst case scenario. So you're having to go from, let's say a mixed grassy pasture or a mixed grassy hay, and then all of a sudden you can only find oaten hay or you can only find barley hay. That's a situation where you just go, you know what, I don't really have any choice here. I have to feed my horse some sort of forage, because not feeding them forage is going to put them at massive risk of gastric ulceration, and it will starve your fibre fermenting bacteria in the hindgut as well, and it'll cause all sorts of psychological stress if your horse doesn't have forage available. So giving them access to that forage is the lesser of two evils in most situations. I'll say most situations because if you have a laminitic horse and oaten hay or one of the cereal hays that's potentially very high in sugars and starches is not going to be ideal, but I'll come back to that point in a minute. That's kind of your worst case scenario. What you should try to do, if you can't find a hay that is similar to the pasture or the hay that the horse was already on, try to find multiple different hays. So even if it was just lucerne and a cereal hay, or if you're in somewhere other than Australia that feeds lots of timothy hay or orchard grass hay, if you can get one grass hay, try to also find a legume hay to incorporate in as well. Or if you can find, 2 or 3 different types of grassy hay, or you might be able to find something like a grass hay haylage or grass hay cubes or hay pellets. So it's pretty rare that you'll only be able to find one type of forage. So let's say you can find an oaten or a barley hay, but you can also find some lucerne or alfalfa hay, plus let's say teff hay cubes and some sort of hay-based pellet. use all four of those things to make up your horse's forage component of their diet, because you're kind of hedging your bets and spreading your risk over 4 different types of forages or more if you can find more. It just means that if you happen to be really unlucky and find a hay that's, say, high in nitrate, or if you do get a cereal hay that's very, very high in non-structural carbohydrate, even for normal horses, those components of a hay can cause problems. So if you changing diets rapidly is not ideal, but then if you change a diet rapidly and also just happen to change to a hay that has got, say, high nitrate, it's going to cause its own set of problems. But if you can split your horse's daily forage intake across lots of different forages, and it doesn't matter really what form they come in, whether they're in pellets or cubes or long stem forages. Long stem's great, obviously, because it makes them chew and it takes more time to eat and all those sorts of things. But if you can incorporate in lots of different types of forages into their diet, it means that if one of those forages happens to be problematic, the influence it's going to have on the diet is lessened. And I go into detail on this in one of our podcast episodes that talks about ingredient variety. So if you go to the Happy Horse Nutrition podcast and search for one on ingredient variety, you'll find that episode. Have a listen to it, because it's really important in horse nutrition in general. So for all horses, it's really important to have ingredient variety. But in these natural disaster situations where you're trying to minimize the negative impact of a sudden diet change on your horse, it's also a really useful strategy to use as many different types of forages as you can, so that you reduce the risk that one of them is going to actually cause a health problem for your horse. If your horse is normally on pasture, something else that might be a little bit unfamiliar to you if you all of a sudden have to feed, like fully hand feed your horse in an emergency situation, is how much to feed them. And it catches a lot of people out because we don't realise how much hay a horse actually needs every day, because you're not out measuring the amount of pasture that a horse is eating on a daily basis. So just some really easy guidelines here. Best case scenario is that you would give your horse between 2 and 3% of their body weight in hay per day. So that's for an average size 500 kilogram horse, that's between 10 and 15 kilograms per day. Now, if you are limited, and we'll talk about that in a second, if your hay supply is limited, you could go down as low as 1%, but that's the absolute minimum. So 5 kilograms for a 500 kilogram horse per day. But if you can avoid doing that, it is best you do. It's always better to feed them up around that 2 to 3% of body weight per day. But like we keep saying in these situations, sometimes your hand is forced. Hey, just dropping in for a tiny moment. If feeding your horse feels messy or confusing, there is an easier way. The My Happy Horse app takes you from guessing to confident in minutes, so you know exactly what your horse needs every day. Think of it as your pocket-sized nutrition genie. Find it at myhappy.horse or on the App Store. All right, back to the show. If you are stuck at home, so say massive floods come through and you can't evacuate anywhere and you've got your horses on high ground or in yards or stables or something like that, and you do have some hay supply but you're unsure of how long you're going to be isolated, try and figure out how much hay you've got, how many horses you need to feed, and then spread the hay out as much as you can for the period of time that you're going to have to feed them that hay. So if you know that you're going to be isolated for 10 days and you've got enough hay for the number of horses that you have, if you were giving them normal hay rations, if you know that you're going to run out on, say, day 5, that's not ideal. You're better off, and again, none of these situations are ideal, but you're better off limiting the amount of hay you feed them each day and spreading that hay supply out over the 10 days that you think you have before you can get more hay either dropped into you or get out to get more hay. Try to spread it out over the amount of time that you know that you're going to be isolated or think you're going to be isolated. And just feed it to them. So if you say, worst case scenario, and it's not ideal, but again, your hand is forced sometimes. If you have to take them down to, around 1% of their body weight in hay per day. So if you would normally feed 10 or 12 kilograms of hay to a 500 kilogram horse, and you're having to bring that down to say 5 kilograms a day because that's all you've got to sustain them over the period of time you're isolated, try and feed it to them, or not try, ideally do feed it to them spread out in very small meals during the day so that they're not going for longer than, say, 4 hours without some forage to chew on. So instead of, giving them 2 lots of 2.5 kilos a day, you might try and give them 10 lots of half a kilo throughout the day so that they're chewing fibre really regularly, even though it's only a small amount. It'll help them mentally. So the horses are so wired to chew, and it's really important to keep that mental stimulation of chewing going for them. It'll also help predominantly their stomach. So if they're chewing and salivating on a regular basis, so putting fibre into their stomach on a regular basis, the risk of gastric ulceration will be reduced. And also the risk of leaky gut. So they're not going to be experiencing that psychological stress of long periods of time without feed, and that we know in other animal species that causes the gut to start leaking. So if you can predictably spread out their hay that you're feeding them over a 24-hour period, it just means that a lot of those stresses are reduced for them, and their gut will hopefully, and then therefore their body will hopefully stay a lot healthier through that period of time that you don't have a lot of hay to feed them. If you're in that situation where you don't have a lot of hay to feed them, but you do have hard feed on hand, and hopefully if you've had some kind of warning that this situation may happen, you've been able to go and get plenty of hay and plenty of feed and have it all there on hand. But if you do have to limit their hay, but you have hard feed on hand, and that can be fibre-based feeds or grain-based feeds, if the horses are already on those feeds, then definitely keep them on those feeds in those situations. If they haven't previously been on those feeds, then do be careful introducing them. So introduce them as slowly as you can. But you can use those feeds to top up their energy and protein intake so that they're not as deficient in energy and protein if you have to severely restrict their forage intake. Hopefully that makes sense. This again is where in my head I'm like, you could calculate all of this out in the My Happy Horse nutrition app. You put in the limited amount of hay, and then you put in the hard feeds that you have, and it will show you how close to a balanced diet you are. And I think probably the most important thing it can do for you in those situations is it will red flag you if you start to feed too much hard feed, because you don't want to overcompensate by feeding them lots of particularly grain-based hard feed, because that will cause its own problems in itself. So don't panic and think, oh my goodness, like I can't feed my horse very much hay because I have a limited supply, so I'll fill them up with grain-based feed, because what that will do is push starch through into your horse's hindgut, and then that will feed what we call the bad bacteria in the hindgut. Their populations absolutely explode really quickly, and that will do more damage to your horse than anything else. So do use hard feed when you've got it available, but don't overfeed it in trying to compensate for loss of pasture or lack of hay, because that's just going to cause other issues for your horse. If you find that you are having to feed reasonably large amounts of hard feed within safe levels, but reasonably large amounts, again, split it up and feed it in really small meals throughout the day so that your horse is never consuming a big meal of hard feed, because that also increases the risk of it being pushed through the small intestine, undigested, and ending up in the hindgut. Again, if you haven't listened to episode number 1, go back and listen to that, because you'll get the foundation for a lot of this stuff that I'm throwing at you now, and that'll just help you understand why we do certain things and why we don't do certain things to keep your horse's gut and your horse healthy and also safe from problems like gastric ulceration and colics. If you find yourself in a situation where you are feeding a hard feed normally to your horse, but because of the natural disaster situation you can't access that hard feed, try and access another feed that is very similar. So, if your horse is normally on a grain-free, low-starch feed, don't suddenly change that horse onto a grain-based, higher-starch feed, because their gut just won't be ready for it. if you're already on a grain-based feed and that has got, a decent amount of starch in it, your horse's gut will already be ready to digest that starch. It knows to expect it. Its pancreas will be producing the enzymes, or the little scissors that cut up and digest starch. So swapping from one feed to another, if you have to, if you're forced to, is not as big an issue in that situation, because your horse's gut is already expecting something very similar to what you're going to feed. Do be conscious of your horse's workload. So if you had a horse that was in a decent amount of work and was therefore getting fed a decent amount of hard feed, if you're in, let's say you're in a near perfect situation where, it might be flooding, you've brought your horses into high ground, you've got plenty of hay on hand, so that's not an issue. And you've also got plenty of hard feed on hand, but because of the flooding, you're not riding and exercising your horse the way you would have. Make sure you reduce your hard feed down, particularly if your horses are confined, because if you keep feeding them the same amount of hard feed, they'll build up a supply of unused energy. And horses are funky little critters. They will express the amount of energy in their diet, in their behaviour. So if you're consistently overfeeding your horse while they're confined, what you'll find is that they just get more and more energetic. I had this really beautifully demonstrated to me when I had to send Poet as a very young horse. He was probably only, 4 or 5 years old, and he cut his foot really badly. It was very wet. We were in boggy mud at the time, and I was going away, and I just couldn't keep him dry and out of the mud while I wasn't at home. So I sent him into a vet clinic for 4 or 5 days so that they could dress his foot for me and keep it dry and give it the best chance of healing. And I said to them, hey, and I'd taken in his vitamin and mineral supplement. Anyway, when I went to pick him up, the vet nurses flat refused to go in the box with him because he was being so dangerous. And I was like, what's happened? And I found out eventually that he'd been getting fed kilograms a day of working horse mix while he was locked up in this stable. And he, as a youngster, was a really high energy horse, and he was just going crazy, locked up in a box, but being fed all of this energy, and he wouldn't let the vet nurses catch him. He was fine when I went in to catch him. He stood there. But I remember I took him home and I tied him to a very safe fence that we had, and he literally stood there and reared up for about half an hour just to bounce some energy. I wasn't game enough to let him go in the paddock because I thought, man, you're going to hurt yourself if I just let you go. He just stood there and bounced up and down on his lead rope. So do be really careful how much you're feeding. Don't keep feeding them as if you are still working them, because I'm not saying that yours will end up doing what Poet did, but it can happen. And they're just so much more prone to hurting themselves when they're full of energy, but they have nowhere to let that energy go. So bring their hard feed right down and fill them up with hay is the best thing to do. If you can keep their diet balanced throughout feeding during a disaster, then great. If it's going to be a short-term thing that you're away from home, or momentarily you can't get what you need to balance their diet, don't panic. It's not going to cause major issues if they're not on a balanced diet for a few weeks. But as soon as possible, try and get all the vitamin and mineral balance back into their diet to make sure that you are meeting all of their vitamin and mineral requirements to keep their immune system functioning and to keep their behaviour regulated, all of the things that all of these nutrients do in our horse's diet for them. My cousin Sarah, who is up in North Queensland and has been really badly flooded for the month, has said to me, I said to her, any tips, Sarah, for what you've been through? And, it was they've got the most beautiful hay and they had a large supply of it in their shed. So their horses were all fine, had a nice big, essentially dry island around their house that all the animals could come into, and their horses came into there as well. But Sarah said lots of hay, make sure they've got access to salt licks. And another thing that she said was be careful to take a little bit of extra care with your old horses or your very young horses or anything that's at the bottom of a pecking order, just to make sure that, they are getting the feed that they need, they're getting access to hay. If you put hay up in a rack, for example, making sure that they get enough time to get in and get access to that hay. And the other really important thing that Sarah raised for me, and thank you, Sarah, for doing that, because it is such an important point, is that when your grass comes back, so, if you're in a bushfire situation, you will eventually get rain and you will get lots and lots of green grass initially coming back. In a flood situation, obviously, as soon as the water drains away, there's plenty of water there to start growing your pasture again. And in fact, an aerial photo that Sarah sent me this morning of their place, it is already bright green. It's amazing. But she made the comment that it's interesting that the horses are still really wanting to eat a lot of the hay, even with all of the fresh green grass around. Now, there's two reasons for that. And there's possibly a lot more reasons as well, but there's two reasons that I'll give you now. Is that very lush green grass doesn't have a lot of fibre in it. And the horses will go looking for the fibre for a couple of reasons. It helps to buffer their stomach and to create the fibrous mat in their stomach that stops the acid from splashing around. So lush green grass is not particularly good at creating a lot of saliva. It's not particularly good at creating any sort of fibre mat in the stomach to stop the acid from splashing around. So they will seek out fibre. And also in the hindgut too, your hindgut microbes really like fibre to hang on to, particularly your fungi, but also the bacteria. They love fibre, and they do actually need some indigestible fibre in order to, have the right structure, I guess, in the hindgut for them to operate normally. So the fibre is really important for them. It's very, very important for forming normal fecal matter. They need fibre when they're on that really lush green pasture. And having done lots of pasture sampling over the years, the really lush green pasture can be less than 10 or 15% dry matter. So for every kilogram of green grass that your horse is eating, they're only getting 100 to 150 grams of actual dry matter. So they need to eat an awful lot of that to meet their daily nutrient requirements as well. And hay is important for helping them do that, and important for getting that dry matter into their diet for them. And then the second really important reason why you should continue to feed hay even when your pasture comes back is that young green grasses can be really high in nitrate. And if you don't give your horse any option other than that young green grass, then they can end up with some sort of nitrate-related issue. So I remember over the years, but one particular drought I remember really clearly. It was a very extended drought, and then it broke really suddenly. And we had broodmares on stud farms in the Hunter Valley actually rupturing their stomachs. And we eventually put it down to high nitrate in those pastures, causing a bloat-like situation in their stomachs and actually rupturing their stomachs. It was horrific. But, you'll get lots of issues with gut health in general. If you've got pregnant mares, then you may end up having mares that will abort if they're on very green grass without any access to hay. So make sure that when your pasture comes back, that you do continue to put hay out for your horses so that they've got an option, and keep putting it out for them as long as they're coming and eating it. So if you're finding that, you've got plenty of grass, but the horses are still really coming and eating a lot of the grassy hay that you're putting out for them, it's probably telling you that there's a reason they're needing that hay, and therefore you should keep putting it out for them. And it's a judgment call really on, if your hay is really palatable. For example, if you were putting out lucerne hay, my horses would come and eat that regardless of how much grass they had. So if you think that they're eating it just because the hay is more palatable than the grass, even when, the grass is grown and it's not young and really lush anymore, it's a judgment call on when you might stop putting hay out. But certainly when you've only got very young, very green pasture there, do continue to keep putting hay out for them. And as quickly as you can. So, you've had natural disaster, you've lost your pasture, you may have lost your hay, you may have had to evacuate. There's some reason why you have to totally upend your horse's diet and change what you're feeding. But once you get through that emergency situation where you're just, feeding them whatever it is you can get your hands on at the time, that time will pass, and you will get back to a point where you can feed your horse normally again. So the faster you can get them back to their normal diet and their balanced diet, the better. It will obviously take a little while for your pasture to come back, but you can keep feeding them whatever hay you've managed to find, and keep looking for hay if you can't initially find the best hay for them. Keep trying to find different hays that you can feed to replace that. But the sooner you can get them back to their normal diet, and certainly the sooner you can get them back to a balanced diet where you know that all of their vitamin and mineral requirements are being met, and that you've got lots of different types of fibre and plenty of forage in the diet, and a good balance of forage to concentrate in the diet. All of those things that are really important for good foundational nutrition. The sooner you can get them back to that, the better. I did say I would come back to horses that have laminitis or other metabolic conditions. They're trickier in these situations because you can feed them hay and feeds. If you can't find, the hay and the feeds that you would normally give them, you can tip them into laminitis if you feed them the wrong hay or the wrong type of feed. And you do have to be really conscious of that, because you don't want to be trying to help them as best you can in an emergency situation only to then trigger a condition like laminitis that is going to cause ongoing issues for you and sort of longer term issues for you to resolve into the future. So I guess nothing about that situation would be easy. That's why I'm struggling trying to think of what to say at this point of time, because it really is a case by case and situation by situation basis. But probably the best thing I can say to you at this point in time is learn as much as you can about what forages are likely to be most suitable for horses that are metabolic with any kind of insulin dysregulation. So, Cushing's horses, now I should say PPID because that's what it's called these days. And any horse that has had laminitis in the past, or you think is prone to laminitis, just learn as much as you can about feeding those horses, so that when it comes to you looking around and thinking, gosh, what am I going to feed these horses in this situation? Or even better, if you're thinking ahead, and this is something that all of us should do that have horses, if we can think ahead and go, okay, if the worst did happen and I was able to have some hay on hand, be it that I can feed in a flood situation where, you can bring your horses onto higher ground and feed them hay, or even if you're escaping from a bushfire, evacuating, and you have time to load the horses and also can fit some hay into a float, even if it was just hay for these horses that have got metabolic conditions, so you know that you've got a safe hay. Find hays that are safe, or haylages even, and have a store of them for a couple of days to a week on hand, so that if you do have to feed in an emergency situation, you know that you've at least got forage that is safe for that horse or those horses in your herd. And then you're not putting them at risk of triggering their laminitis and trying to save their lives by feeding them a hay or other forage that you can find during those emergency situations. So that'd be best case scenario. Have something on hand that you know. Worst case scenario is try and find whatever you think the safest hay is. If you're really not sure, if you're in a really tight situation where you have to feed hay that you think is not going to be safe, soaking it might save you. So if you can soak the hay for a couple of hours and then make sure that you lift it out to soak it, ideally put it into hay nets, or there's some really cool soaking equipment that's available now that will drain all the water away for you. But if you're probably not going to have that in an emergency situation. So hay nets, if you've managed to grab some of those, and then before you feed the hay, lift it out of the soaking water, make sure you tip the soaking water out somewhere. Don't give your horse access to that, and let the water drain away from the hay fully before you feed it to your horse. So if you're stuck and you're really not sure whether a hay is going to be safe, then soaking it first before you feed it is going to help to some extent. The last little thing that I want to just say here, and hopefully it will help you be a little bit more relaxed feeding in these situations, is don't worry too much about the energy content of the hay that you do end up feeding to horses that you've needed to find a new hay source for whatever reason. It's going to be reasonably short term that you're feeding them an emergency supply of hay. So if you are having to just take whatever you can get, it's going to be a reasonably short time period that you're doing that. So if, for example, you have got a pony that is a really good doer and all you can find is good quality grassy hay, we know that if you fed the pony that long term, it's probably going to put on quite a bit of weight. But, for a week, even 2 weeks on a hay, it's much better that they eat that hay than no hay at all. So, don't stress too much about weight gain. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you have, I don't know, let's say a thoroughbred that was in full eventing work and fit, and all you can find is a really quite average quality stemmy grass hay, also don't worry about that too much. Your horse may lose a little bit of weight, but the most important thing is that you give them enough bulk and enough hay that they're going to be happy chewing, they'll keep their stomach full, they're producing lots of saliva to keep them at much lower risk of gastric ulceration, and also that you're feeding their hindgut microbes and you're keeping that big hindgut of theirs full so that they don't end up at higher risk of colic from simply not having enough fibre in their gut. So just you get forced into situations sometimes, don't worry too much, because there's really not a whole lot that can't be undone by feeding a hay that is less than optimal in terms of energy and protein content over a reasonably short period. So don't stress too much. Do make sure as much as possible that the hay is hygienic, it's clean, it's not mouldy, and that it's as suitable for your horse as you can find. But cut yourself a whole lot of slack if you can't find a perfect hay for your horse in an emergency situation, because honestly, just getting hay to them and making sure that their gut's full and they've got lots to chew on is going to get you a long way toward making sure that they're happy and safe and that their gut health is maintained. All right. That's about all I have to say without getting into the many fine details on natural disaster nutrition for horses. If there's one concept to remember, it is keep your horse's diet as close to normal as you possibly can. In emergencies like fires and floods, feeding often becomes a take what you can get situation. But making the best choices available to you gives your horses the best chance of handling these emergencies well. As a really quick recap, start with the basics. Water. A simple rule of thumb is if it's not clean enough for you to drink, it's not clean enough for your horse. I know I say it a lot, but it is so true, and especially so in these situations. And if stress or unfamiliar water makes your horse reluctant to drink, a small, sensible amount of salt can help switch their thirst response back on, but only give that to them if they have free access to water afterwards. Next, think forage first. Hay is your horse's lifeline in these situations. So the best case is swap pasture for a similar grassy hay. But if you can't get like for like, aim for variety. Use a mix of hays and forage cubes, forage pellets, whatever you can find, because spreading the forage sources reduces the risk of any one problem hay or problem product causing trouble for your horse. If hay is limited, ration it and spread it out. Lots of small feeds throughout the day beats 2 big ones, because that steady chewing protects the stomach and provides constant food for the hindgut microbes. And if you use hard feed to top up calories, be careful not to overdo it, especially grain-based feeds, because that can create a whole new set of gut issues and start to cause hindgut dysbiosis for your horse, and then that's something that can take quite a while to rectify once you come through the emergency situation, and also puts your horse at risk of lots of problems, including laminitis and colic and things that you really don't want to have to be dealing with during an emergency. Also, if your horse isn't working, remember to reduce your hard feed accordingly. When your pasture does return, keep hay available for a while, because that lush regrowth can be low in fibre and sometimes high in nitrates. So hay gives horses a safer fibre option while things stabilise out in your pastures. And finally, if you've got a metabolic or laminitis prone horse, planning ahead matters even more for them. Know your safe forage options. If you haven't already, have a listen to our Keeping Laminatics Safe podcast, where we talk about in a lot more detail hays that are safe for horses prone to laminitis. And if you're unsure whether the hay you do have is safe for your laminitis prone horse, then soaking the hay for a few hours can help reduce the risk. If I was to put this podcast into a single sentence, it would be prioritise water, prioritise fibre, use variety, feed little and often, and don't panic. It really can undo most short-term compromises later, but maintaining hydration and protecting the gut with fibre during the crisis is going to be what gets your horse through safely and what is going to keep them, I guess, in the best mental shape as well. And remember, keeping your horse well fed all the time is ultimately what gives them the best protection should the worst happen and you need to employ emergency feeding practices. If you are currently experiencing natural disasters or the after effects of one, my thoughts are with you. I really hope this helps. If you are listening to this and hoping you never need to use these strategies, I hope you are right. But I also hope that it leaves you feeling a little prepared should you ever need this knowledge. Thank you for listening. Take care, and I'll catch you next time. If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse virtual equine nutritionist, you can head on over to myhappy.horse. And also, while you're there, check out the Dr Nerida AI, which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.